end game in Ukraine, that's right. End game in Ukraine now seems to have begun. The Russian Northern Army Group, newly formed Northern Army Group, has commenced operations in the northern direction towards Kharkiv. Now, on the 9th of May, as you will recall, was Russia's victory day in the Great Patriotic War. Very few people expected that immediately the very next day Russia would launch its long heralded counter-offensive. What were the Russians really waiting for? The Russians were waiting for primarily the ground to harden so that it would sustain massive tank maneuvers off the road axes. Without that, no armored assault is really possible. The ground was to harden. It was expected around 15th of May, the earliest. Actually, that can even go down to end May or to beginning of June. June actually is the campaign season in this part of the world. Don't forget that even the German offensive had been launched in the month of June. All major attacks have come around June. But the Russians preponed this offensive for two main reasons. There was a lot of talk of the $61 billion aid package, actually the bulk of which was to make up for the arms that America had supplied from its own military inventory. To make up those, they had to use that money. But whatever it is, they had already sent in 8 ACAMs, they have already sent in a fair amount of artillery ammunition, but it wasn't sufficient to really, meet the demands of the Ukrainians. So the Russians wanted to exploit this window of opportunity prevented by the late supply of American arms and ammunition. And don't forget that from 23rd October onwards last year, there were no American supplies till almost the beginning of March this year, when even before the sanction by the American Senate, they had started supplying 8 ACAMs. The aim initially was to hit in retaliation for the Russian attacks on the power infrastructure grid, which had been extremely effective, which had destroyed the bulk of the Ukrainian power grid in around the capital and in the northern portions, as also in the eastern portions. They had destroyed the bulk of the electrical grid. This not only affected daily life, but please don't forget, it also affected arms production, especially in the drone factories. The drones, smaller drones which the Ukrainians have been making in-house and using to quite good effect to keep striking Russian territory in Belgorod and Kursk and the other areas, they have been quite badly disrupted. Also, this affects lack of power generation, affects your electrical railway system. You can't really move large masses of troops around if your power is down. So these attacks on the power grid by the Russians, using their new FAB 1500, 2000 and 3000 kilogram glide toss bombs. These are normal dumb bombs, very heavy dumb bombs, but with a strap-on GPS kind of guidance kit using the Russian GLONASS navigational guidance system. They have been really very effective in trying to degrade Ukrainian defenses, in trying to hit Ukrainian targets in a very massive way. Also, Russian electronic warfare has been a great game changer. They've been able to jam a fair proportion of the Ukrainian radars, their locating radars, their weapon guidance radars, etc. They've been able to jam those. They've been able to jam drones. They've been able to jam the TACAMs, 8 ACAMs which have been provided by the Americans. So this is what caused a sea change in the correlation of forces on the battlefield, and Russia was keen to exploit this. So on the 10th of May, they launched their offensive in the north, headed for Kharkiv, the second largest city in the whole of Ukraine. Don't forget, Kharkiv had held out quite well when the Russians initially attacked in February 2022. This was one place where they had put up a very solid defense because they were old existing defenses which were there on the ground. But that is where the big surprise has come. The first line of defense of the Kharkiv Oblast was virtually non-existent. Ukrainian soldiers have been complaining that no mines had been laid, there were no anti-tank ditches, no dragon teeth worth the name, and the Russians just walked in. The Russian assault detachments just walked in. The Russians also have learned their lesson because of the very heavy effectiveness of kamikaze drones. They are now not attacking en masse tank columns, those old blitzkrieg style masses of tanks breaking through at selected points. All that is now history. They have been attacking using small infantry detachments, smaller squads of 5 to 6 on their fast attack vehicles, their light dune buggies that they were called in Iraq. These have been put to very effective use by the Russians because they don't want to present big targets while attacking, so that either the enemy drones, enemy artillery cannot deal with them and inflict prohibitive losses as they were inflicting earlier. Now, the Russian troop concentrations in the north were about 50,000 troops of the 44th Army Corps of the Russians, newly raised 44 Army Corps, which is deployed over a 400 kilometers front on the northern front facing the Kharkiv area, right? This was actually in three concentrations of troops, 3 concentration areas. There were about 8,000 in Bryansk, there were about 10,500 in Kursk, and there were about 30,000 or a corps size in in Belgorod. The Russian troop concentration were in 3 blobs. There was Bryansk in the extreme west, which had about 8,000 troops, a little weak division you can say. Then there was Kursk, which had about 10,800 troops, almost a division. And then there was a corps size concentration of about 30,000 troops in Belgorod, right? And these were mostly part of the 44 Army Corps, which with their newly raised 72nd Motorized Rifle Division. These were the troops arrayed against the Kharkiv salient. But the simple fact is 50,000 troops are not enough to launch a major offensive to take a city of the size of Kharkiv. The minimum would be 100,000 troops or 150,000 troops would be really required if you wanted to make a meaningful presentation. So there was a lot of speculation that this offensive which is coming in from the north is a deception operation, or what the Russians call part of their Maskorovka, that is deception kind of operations to deflect the attention of the enemy towards a different sector while the main attack comes in another sector. But even a Maskorovka operation has to be credible, if it has to be effective. It cannot be just a weak push, or it just cannot be reconnaissance force or probing attacks. It has to be a meaningful attack in case you want to divert the enemy's attention, convince him that this is the main attack. And the Russians carried it out, I think, very, very masterfully. About 2 weeks back, there were on the Telegram channels a kind of a map which had been disseminated, that a Polish colonel had said this is the way the Russians could launch a massive offensive from the north. And that showed a major offensive which was to bypass the town of Kharkiv, the city of Kharkiv rather, and go in for the depth, try and outflank all the Ukrainian forces which are deployed towards the east, facing Bakhmut, facing Avdiivka, etc., get behind them and make a beeline, make a run for the Dnieper River. Make a line for the Dnieper River, sweep around both sides of Kharkiv and head for the Dnieper River. Also possibly launch major attacks from the eastern direction towards Kharkiv as they had done in 2022. So this map was spread on the Telegram channel as part of, I think, these Maskarovka operations these deception operations. Also, there was some news spread in the media, social media and otherwise, that General Survakin, the feared General Armageddon, had been brought back into service and he was going to head this offensive. So, just like in the Second World War, the Allied had used the name of Patton, the fearsome reputation of Patton. Patton was not taking part in the initial Normandy landing. He was kept out of it, but the word was spread that he is going to be heading operations there. And by his very reputation, it drew a lot of attention as to where the attack will be coming, in the wrong direction of Pas-de-Calais instead of Normandy. So they used the name of Survikin to try and fool the Ukrainians into thinking that a major offensive was planned from the north. The beauty of this whole exercise is that though a deception operation, it has the full potential to be turned into a main operation by just simply switching reserves to this side. The deception operation can be turned into a main operation if it succeeds very well. And this operation towards Kharkiv did make very good progress, surprisingly good progress. I think even the Russians were surprised at the kind of progress it had made in such a short time of just about 5 to 6 days. This has captured about 200 square kilometers plus of Ukrainian territory. It has come within 17 kilometers of the Kharkiv, the city of Kharkiv itself. It had just breezed through the first line of defenses. It's now leaning on the second line of defenses and also trying to probe beyond. And it could well, they have already started their massive air bombardment with using the FAB, a series of glide toss bombs onto Kharkivs, along with their long range rockets and missiles, their multi-barrel rocket launchers. They are pounding hell into Kharkiv, making mincemeat of Kharkiv. And we'll have to wait and watch. But if the morale of the Ukrainian is going to crumble as it has in the initial battles, in the battle of the so-called first line, the Ukrainian defense just evaporated. The Ukrainians had to sack their local area commander. The Ukrainian commander was given the marching orders. He was sacked for his failure to even offer token resistance. And then there were units that began to surrender. And the very famous Russian volunteer corps that Ukraine had raised and which had been launching pinprick attacks towards Belgorod and other Russian cities, that just crumbled. It has not put up any fight at all. A number of them have surrendered because, after all, mercenaries don't have their heart in the fight. Overall, so far the Russians have pushed forward about 400 tanks, 180 armored fighting vehicles and about 950 pieces of artillery, especially multi-barrel rocket launchers and 155mm caliber weapons. And of course, this has been heavily backed up by Russian tactical aviation. The Iskander strikes had knocked out the communication tower, especially for their air defense communications and radars, etc. They have been using electronic warfare to prepare the battlefield very well. And by and large, this has been an infantry predominant operation so far. They have, as I mentioned, penetrated the first line, established two major bridgeheads in the east and the west. There is a central portion still holding out, which they are in the process of clearing out, and they have reached the second line of defense, which is better prepared because it was in depth. The forward line, the Ukrainians could not prepare so well because of the simple fact that it was under artillery shelling, air attack and fire from the Russians. So I think their defensive preparations were hampered. But one is quite surprised that they were so badly neglected and poor. All this talk of corruption, this does not amount to corruption. This, if money has been given by the government for preparation of anti-tank ditches, defenses, laying of mines, and if those are laid, it's not corruption, it is treachery. It is treachery, but that is the fact. There are a lot of Ukrainian troops who have been complaining that there was just no minefields where there were supposed to be heavy minefields. There were no anti-tank ditches, etc., no reinforced cement concrete defenses, and the Russians just walked through the first line of defense. And with a heavy artillery bombardment, with the heavy air attacks, the morale crumbled, and there have been they are saying 4,500 Ukrainian troops have been taken prisoners. They are just 17 kilometers from Kharkiv city per se, and at the rate at which they are advancing, they could go much further. Now I think the Russians, the main objective here was to pull out the Ukrainian troops from the other sectors and thereby facilitate the main attack that was bound to come in the Donetsk, because that is about 40% of Donetsk still the Russians are to capture, and that is their primary task, because they want to secure the area that they had laid claims to as being of Russian origin or inhabited by Russian speaking people. So in case they were to make successful attacks there, where the defense lines had become very thick, heavy minefields had been laid, the fighting was painfully slow because they were fighting in built up areas. So if these defenses had to be thinned out, they had to draw Ukrainian attention somewhere else. Have they succeeded in that? Entirely. The Ukrainians have rushed forward their 60th and 63rd Mechanized Brigade to this sector. From the Kherson sector in the south, there are reports that they have pulled out 3 marine brigades which were launching ineffectual attacks and not achieving very much. They have been pulled out and they have been pushed out towards the northern sector to thicken up the defenses of Kharkiv and to put up a better fight in this area. Just in this thinning out of the Kherson sector, Zaporizhzhia sector, they may have created windows of opportunities for the Russians to exploit, to push towards Odessa. And also there are reports that they may be also thinning out some troops from the depth areas of Bakhmut and Avdiivka. And if that happens, and if the Russian main offensive comes there, then the Ukrainians are in a severe problem. You see, if you launch a very proper feint, a very well planned feint, then if that succeeds, that itself can become the main. And should the Ukrainians quite obviously haven't ignored this, the Russian plan has worked to the extent that about 6 brigades plus of Ukrainian troops have been pulled out from other sectors and have been rushed in here to reinforce the Kharkiv sector. So if the Russians find the going very tough there, they will simply divert their reserves to the Bakhmut, Avdiivka sectors, to Charsiv Yar, and to progress operations, right? And if the Kharkiv northern direction makes better headway, then that famous plan by the Polish colonel, which was put on the Telegram media channels, can be put into effect. They can bypass Kharkiv, avoid the fighting in the built up area there, if it is proving to be a hard nut to crack, rush straight for the Dnieper river banks, right? Come behind the entire army group of forces of the Ukrainians deployed in the east ahead of Bakhmut, Charsiv Yar, Avdiivka, etc. Get behind them, get them in a pincer move and lead to their destruction in the standard Russian cauldrons. So Ukraine is now in trouble. And what are the its Western allies doing? Anthony Blinken was in Kyiv, also taking part in musical programs, and he has promised them $2 billion worth of aid. The subtext was that $1.6 billion has already is part of the $61 billion aid already sanctioned by the American Senate. So at best what the Americans can do is, add more artillery ammunition, add some more 8 TACAMs, and the British and the French could add a few more cruise missiles, to what they have sent already. But the simple fact is, all this brave talk of putting boots on the ground of sending 1,500 French soldiers, 60,000 French, Polish and other NATO soldiers to combat the Russians in Ukraine was all bluff and bluster. The Russians called the ambassador of France, they called the ambassador of Britain, and they have more or less read out the Retd Act. They have threatened the use of tactical nuclear weapons. They have threatened that if their cities are attacked, they will strike cities in France and Great Britain. And if they want a third world war, so be it. They are quite clear that they will not let their cities just be attacked like that and the perpetrators or those attackers can go unpunished. They have made it very clear. They have absolutely outlined the threat is not bluff and bluster, and it seems to have worked in that it has cooled the order for that all that talk of putting French boots on the ground, Polish boots on the ground to stiffen up the Ukrainian defenses, or at the very least to put these troops in western Ukraine so that they could free the military detachments, whatever there are, and police elements to go and fight forward in the meat grinder in northern and eastern Ukraine. So that is where the situation now is. It is poised towards an end game in which Russia within the next 2 months could inflict a rather humiliating defeat on the Ukrainians, push them to the other side of the Dnieper river and try and secure a safe zone from which no ATACMs can reach Russia from Ukrainian territory. That is the progress of the battle on the Kharkiv salient, on the Kharkiv front. The Russians have progressed very well. More than 200 square kilometers of territory captured, more than 12 villages captured. First line totally breached. Second line they are fighting on, and they are even making heavy bombardments, preparation of the battlefield as far as the Battle of Kharkiv is concerned. They could take Kharkiv, that could take a month plus at the very least, or they could contain and bypass Kharkiv and go in for the depth areas on the Dnieper river. What about the Russian mobilization? You know that in the August-September of 2022, the first year of the war itself, the Russians had been forced to mobilize 300,000 reservists. 300,000 reservists, which then they created rapidly the Surovikin line. They manned that Surovikin line, and they were totally able to absorb the Ukrainian much heralded counter-offensives which came in the month of June last year. Both the 9 and 10 corps offensives were totally blunted. Heavy casualties have been inflicted, which the Ukrainians are not admitting to, but the fact is they have been bled white. What the Ukrainians are short of now is manpower and artillery ammunition. And these are critical war winning factors, especially in the kind of war that is being fought in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. The Ukrainians are in deep trouble, and all the promises made by the NATO and the Americans have turned out, unfortunately for the Ukrainian people, to be fairly hollow. They will, as of now, no boots are being put on the ground. There was a lot of posturing to deter Russia. 90,000 NATO troops, American troops were carrying out a major exercise in Poland and elsewhere to sort of threaten Russia that they could intervene. That intervention has just not failed to materialize, because when push came to shove, they backed off from trying to spark, and rationally, it was a rational decision to back off from instigating, triggering a third world war, which could easily have led to crossing of the nuclear threshold, at least at the tactical levels. So they have not intervened on the ground. All that they are doing it, their counter strategy seems to be to have propaganda victories in terms of cruise missile attacks on the Crimean territory. There was an attack made on their missile defense batteries, the S-400 batteries, which was there in Crimea. That was struck by these missile attacks, ATACMS, as also by the cruise missiles, to sort of punch a hole in the sky and enable attacks on the Sevastopol port, the bridges, the Russian ships, etc., and strike at Crimea to sort of gain a propaganda advantage. They are not provoking the Russians beyond a point. I haven't seen any more major strikes into Russia proper itself. They are concentrating their ire on Crimea in a demonstrative series of strikes using the ATACMS, as also the cruise missiles which have been supplied, the Storm Shadow missiles, etc., which have been supplied by the British and the French. So I think in the crucial phase of the battle is coming before the end of this month, beginning of next month. We will see this battle reach its crescendo, and the Russians have basically two options. If the northern axis unexpectedly turns to be highly successful, they could put their main weight of their offensive on the north. They could attack in Sumy and progress options towards Kyiv from Belgorod, from Sumy, as also from the side of Kharkiv. They could progress, they could take Kharkiv. Already the offensive has started, and they have now a river flotilla which they have created very specifically for an attack on Odessa. And the attack in Kharkiv has pulled away 3 marine brigades from the Kherson area in the south, and that gives the Russians an opportunity to develop operations towards Odessa, also from the southern direction. And they can also come via the Dnieper river in their major river flotillas that they have created. They may for this have to also cross over to the western bank of the Dnieper to get a safe corridor for their river flotilla to sail down the Dnieper river and to go for the operations into Odessa. But I would rather reckon that they could cross the Dnieper in the Kherson area, in the Zaporizhzhia area, and progress operations towards Odessa. Their primary end targets could be Odessa, Kharkiv and Kyiv, not necessarily in that order, but this seems to be the Russian game plan. There were talk that they would be mobilizing more troops in case they were to launch major offensives. They haven't done so. But the counterpoint is that the Russians' normal recruitment has succeeded very well. The attack in the north has been launched by their 44 Army Corps and their 72 Motor Rifle Division, all freshly raised from recruits. And these recruits have performed very well because they've been given adequate time to train very hard. So I don't think Russia will really need any further mobilizations. Even with the current level of mobilization and the normal recruitment of their conscripts, they seem to have reached almost 1 million man troops. And they were building up their forces because they were seriously concerned about a NATO intervention, American NATO intervention, which would have given an entirely different character to this war. Then it would really have been a war to the finish, and in which the Russians, I am very certain, would have had no hesitation in using tactical nuclear weapons. They had already started commencing their war drills for incorporating tactical nuclear weapons in military exercises. The lesson or the implications have been driven home clearly to all decision makers, whether in London, in Paris, in Washington, that the Russians mean business. They are now serious, and one feels sorry for the Ukrainian people that they have been led up the garden path. They have suffered terrible slaughter, the entire destruction of their cities and infrastructure, and if it comes to naught, if it comes to nothing, then it would be a tragedy of monumental proportions. Thank you.